As the Nazis had promised, they moved quickly to transform Germany from a constitutional democracy into an authoritarian dictatorship. An early step they took was to get rid of all rival political parties. Some were banned outright, the rest were pressured to dissolve themselves, and in July of 1933, the Nazis banned the formation of new political parties. In 1934, the Nazis further consolidated their power and augmented Hitler's. Hitler had almost always had a strong grip on the internal politics of the Nazi Party, but it had never been absolute. 1934 brought an internal purge and an elimination of Hitler's rivals. The triggering event was Ernst Röhm's attempted rebellion. Röhm had been head of the SA, the Storm Division, which was the paramilitary wing of the party. Röhm had used his position to form a rival power bloc and secretly attempted a rebellion. Hitler had been warned ahead of time of the rebellion and was able to suppress it. In the purge that followed, 43 conspirators and rivals were executed. And along with the purge, there were many unofficial assassinations as old scores within the party were settled. The result of all the bloodletting was a Nazi party united even more strongly around Adolf Hitler. In August of the same year, President Hindenburg died. Paul von Hindenburg had been the grand old man of German politics, holding the office of the presidency, which along with the chancellorship was one of the two highest offices in the land. Upon Hindenburg's death, Hitler effectively merged the office of the presidency and the chancellorship, thus augmenting his power further. In a nationwide plebiscite to confirm the merger, almost 90% of Germans voted in favor of augmenting Hitler's power. The Nazis now controlled all the major political offices, they had cleaned house internally, and they had gotten rid of all the rival political parties. In firm control, they then set about reshaping all of German society. Political tools such as physical force and authoritarian laws are necessary for a dictatorship, but long-term control of a people also requires controlling their minds. The Nazis recognized this and made reshaping Germany's educational system a high priority. They already had a good start. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, about 2.5 million Germans were members of the Nazi Party. 7% were members of the upper class, 7% were peasants, 35% were industrial workers, and the largest group, 51%, were members of the professional and middle classes. Surprisingly, in this latter group, the professional and middle classes, the single largest occupational group represented was elementary school teachers. The Nazis thus already had a core group of followers in a position to help them shape the minds of the next generation. The Nazis had a particular kind of youth in mind. As early as 1925, Hitler had written in Mein Kampf the following: "The Volkisch state must not adjust its entire educational work primarily to the inoculation of mere knowledge, but to the breeding of absolutely healthy bodies. The training of mental abilities is only secondary." Come 1933 and power, Hitler repeatedly made it even clearer what kind of healthy bodies he wanted the educational system to produce. "My program for educating youth is hard. Weakness must be hammered away. In my castles of the Teutonic Order, a youth will grow up before which the world will tremble. I want a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be all that. It must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. That is how I will eradicate thousands of years of human domestication. That is how I will create the new order." Intellectual training was less emphasized than physical training, but it was not omitted. Students were trained in Nazi ideology, they studied German history from a National Socialist perspective, they were trained in political activism, and they taught themselves to develop a selfless, obedient, duty-oriented moral character. The curriculum was revised, textbooks were rewritten, and teachers were recruited as servants of the cause. Early in the Nazi regime, teachers were declared to be civil servants and required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, swearing an oath of absolute fidelity to Adolf Hitler. In addition to transforming the formal school system, the Nazis placed great emphasis on the Hitler Youth Organization. The party's youth organization had been formed in 1922, early in the party's history, though it acquired its Hitler Youth name in 1926. The purpose of the Hitler Youth was to form a cadre of devoted young followers outside the formal school system. Boys could join the program at age 6, though formal training began at age 10. All members of the Hitler Youth swore this oath. In the presence of this blood banner, which represents our Führer, I swear to devote all my energies and my strength to the savior of our country, Adolf Hitler. I am ready and willing to give up my life for him, so help me God. Full membership and systematic training began at age 14 and included being able to take a physical beating without whining. Brutal fighting sessions among the boys were common and encouraged, as Hitler had put in Mein Kampf, but above all, the young, healthy body must also learn to suffer blows. If a boy was unable to withstand the pain or pressure, he was embarrassed in front of his peers. Those who succeeded, though, received accolades, a sense of belonging to a great cause, and useful symbols of their status, such as this special dagger. Parallel programs existed for girls, instruction focused on home, family, and the duty to bear children. Training of the girls was similar to the training of the boys, including wearing military-style uniforms, engaging in soldier-like activities, and learning Nazi ideology and activism. Although the members of the Hitler Youth were encouraged to question their parents, their non-Nazi teachers, and church officials, within the Hitler Youth, absolute obedience was demanded. Despite this, membership in the Hitler Youth was appealing to many young Germans. Summer camps and parades were regular Hitler Youth activities. There was also a feeling of camaraderie and a sense of developing self-discipline, honor, and loyalty. Membership in the Hitler Youth came to be a badge of honor, and as the Nazi Party came closer to realizing power, even became a status symbol. In 1932, the year before the Nazi Party came to power, the Hitler Youth had about 108,000 members, or about 5% of the German youth population. Within a year, membership in the Hitler Youth had swollen to over 2 million members. In 1936, membership in the Hitler Youth was made mandatory. All other German youth groups had ceased to exist, been absorbed into the Hitler Youth, or abolished. And by 1939, the year that World War II was to begin, membership in the Hitler Youth reached almost 8 million members. The Nazis had also achieved great success with older students, those of university age. Well before Hitler came to power, Nazi student groups existed at universities all over Germany. Before 1933, it was a common sight to see students wearing brown shirts and swastika armbands in class. And in many cases, it was the most intelligent and idealistic university students who were the most activist and outspoken supporters of National Socialism. And the students had many allies among their professors. When the National Socialists came to power, they prohibited all Jews from holding academic positions. This resulted in the firing of hundreds of Jewish professors, including at least 5 Nobel laureates. To their credit, many other professors resigned in protest or emigrated. But such professors were in the small minority. But a large majority of university professors remained on the job, either passively accepting the new regime or even actively supporting it. In 1933, for example, 960 professors, including such prominent figures as philosopher Martin Heidegger, made a public proclamation of support for Adolf Hitler and the new National Socialist regime. The photo shows Martin Heidegger at a Nazi party rally in 1933. What the Nazis established for the schools and universities, they attempted to establish for German society at large by means of sweeping government regulations on media and outright censorship. The world of schools and education was merely an important microcosm of the Nazis' plans for all of German society. Joseph Goebbels, Germany's new propaganda chief, put it this way: "Any book or work of art which acts subversively on our future or strikes at the root of German thought, the German home, and the driving forces of our people should be destroyed." The great symbolic event of what was to come occurred early in the Nazi regime, the May 10, 1933 book burnings, just a few months after the Nazis assumed power. In an open square across from the University of Berlin, 20,000 books were burned in a huge bonfire. Joseph Goebbels spoke at the event to 40,000 cheering spectators. Some of the authors whose books were destroyed include Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, Jack London, Helen Keller, H.G. Wells, Sigmund Freud, Emile Zola, and Marcel Proust. An important and sometimes overlooked fact about the book burnings is that they were not instigated by the Nazi government, nor were they instigated by non-intellectual thugs. The book burnings were instigated by university students. The Nazi student organization conceived and executed the book burnings all over Germany that night. Book bonfires burned brightly in every German university city. The professors had taught their students well. Goebbels' official title was Minister for the Reich Chamber of Culture. The Reich Chamber of Culture controlled 7 major cultural spheres: art, music, theater, literature, the press, radio, and film. This gave Goebbels control over all of the German media and enabled him to use effectively his formidable talent for propaganda. He quickly established regulations that anyone working in any of those cultural fields had to become a member of the Nazi Party and join their respective cultural chamber. The purpose of the regulations, as Goebbels put it, in order to pursue a policy of German culture, it is necessary to gather together the creative artists in all spheres into a unified organization under the leadership of the Reich. The Reich must not only determine the lines of progress, mental and spiritual, but also lead and organize the professions. In the realm of art, Hitler and Goebbels attempted to cleanse Germany of modern art and to replace it with Germanic art. Classical plays, music, and opera were still allowed, as were Hollywood B-movies, but galleries exhibiting modern art were shut down. Newspapers received close supervision. The Reich Press Law of 1933 prohibited editors from marrying Jews and required that the editors meet daily with the propaganda ministry to ensure that no misleading stories were published. Essentially, this gave the government power to tell the newspapers what they could and could not print. Likewise, radio was taken over in 1933 by a branch of the propaganda ministry, the Chamber of Radio. The Chamber of Film took over the content of the film industry, though it left the production of films up to private firms. In all areas of art and culture, uncooperative editors, writers, or performers were ousted, or sent to prison, or sent to concentration camps, or sometimes killed. Editors, performers, and writers who remained knew how they were expected to behave. All of German culture thus became an obedient tool of Nazi politics. Nazi education and censorship attempted to control people's minds, but the Nazis also controlled people's bodies as much as possible. Milder controls involved new public health measures, such as an aggressive campaign against smoking. The Nazis banned smoking in certain public places, placed restrictions on how tobacco could be advertised, and ran an aggressive anti-smoking campaign. Stronger controls extended to people's sex and reproductive lives, and here we enter darker territory: the Nazi embrace of eugenics. Eugenics was not unique to the Nazis or to Germany. As early as 1895, eugenics researcher Adolf Hitler published a book called The Right to Death, which called for state control of reproduction. And many intellectuals in many countries embraced eugenics. In nature, the argument runs, only the strongest males get to mate with the females, while the weaker males mate less frequently or not at all. This natural selection of the strong and deselection of the weaker serves to keep the species healthy and makes it stronger. The same principle holds for farming. Just as a farmer is concerned to improve the quality of his herd, the state should be concerned to improve the quality of its citizenry. The farmer will not let any old bull mate with any old cow, so the state should not let any male have sex with any female. The farmer will select only his healthiest and strongest bulls and let them mate only with his strongest and healthiest cows. Any cows or bulls not up to snuff will be culled from the herd and not allowed to reproduce at all. As Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of the Reich, would say a little later, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. Before the Nazis came to power, German intellectuals were among the world leaders of eugenics research. Dr. Ernst Rudin was the president of the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations. In 1920, psychiatry professor Alfred Hock and Judge Carl Binding jointly published a book called The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life. Their book called for the destruction of unworthy human beings in favor of protecting worthy human beings. So-called worthless individuals included the mentally and physically disabled. Another book, The Principles of Human Heredity and Racial Hygiene by Drs. Fischer, Lenz, and Bauer, hailed the superiority of the German race and called for the use of concentration camps for non-Germans and mixed races. Fischer already had experience with this. In South Africa, he had planned and executed the forced sterilization of the offspring of German military men with indigenous South African women. By the time the Nazis came to power, eugenics was an established part of German intellectual life. One striking indication of this is that German universities had 23 official professors of racial hygiene. National Socialism held that the state should take over where natural selection left off. In line with their collectivism and anti-individualism, they believed that medicine and reproduction should serve the interests of the state, not the individual. Like the farmer, the Nazis wanted high-quality Aryan children, so they took charge of the mating process of Germany's citizens. The Reich could not allow individuals to rut with just anyone. Taking away individual choice would improve the stock of the nation and cleanse it of inferior genetic elements. The Nazis thus argued that they were more strongly socialist than their arch rivals, the communists. While the communists were almost exclusively focused on issues of money, capitalism, and economics, the Nazis argued for a more comprehensive socialism. Every aspect of human life, including family and reproductive life, was to be socialized. The Nazi eugenics program had two faces, positive and negative. The positive face aimed at increasing the number of pure Aryan births, while the negative face aimed at eliminating the inferior genetic influences in Germany. In order to implement both sides of the program, the Nazis first needed to define racial purity. They decided that there were three races: full Jew, having 3 or more Jewish grandparents; 2 degrees of Mischlinge, or mixed types, having either 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents; and full Aryan, having no Jewish grandparents. The pure Aryan would be the tall, slender, yet strong, blonde human being. Naturally, this led to some serious parity, given that not many of the Nazi leadership met those criteria. Neither Goebbels, nor Goering, nor Hitler himself obviously met the criteria. All humor aside, the Nazis set about achieving the positive face of their program in several ways. They provided incentives to encourage racially pure marriages. Incentives included loans to help young married couples get established, subsidies for each child produced, and official awards such as this medal offered to hero mothers of 4 or more children. Childless couples were vilified. The Nazi government also lowered the age of marriage to 16. They encouraged the birth of illegitimate Aryan children. They outlawed abortion for Aryans. They strictly regulated birth control. They made it illegal for sterile women to get married, and initially they forbade mothers from working outside the home. Heinrich Himmler was in charge of this aspect of Nazi policy. Himmler was also the chief of the SS and of the Gestapo, making him one of the 2 or 3 most powerful Nazis in the regime. Under Himmler's direction, the Nazis created the Lebensborn program in 1935. The program established group homes for young Aryan women impregnated by Aryan men. After racial purity was established, the women were provided with lodging, food, and medical care. In return, they signed away the rights to their fetuses, who, upon birth, would be placed with good Nazi families. Between 12,000 and 16,000 children were born in Lebensborn homes in Nazi Germany and in Nazi-occupied territories. A few years later, in order to speed up the development of the pure Aryan race, the Nazis began to kidnap Aryan children in Nazi-occupied territories. An estimated 250,000 children ages 6 years and younger were taken back to Germany and assimilated into Nazi homes. The negative face of the Nazi eugenics program called for the elimination of non-Aryans. In 1935, the Nazis implemented the Nuremberg laws for the protection of hereditary health. The laws called for the forcible sterilization of individuals with mental or hereditary physical defects. In the 1930s, an estimated 400,000 individuals were sterilized. Certification of Aryan descent became a requirement for marriage. Interracial marriages were prohibited, and the remaining rights of Jews were revoked. The Nazis then turned to extermination. In May of 1935, the regime euthanized 12 mental patients at a hospital in Hadamar, Germany. The Nazi Interior Ministry then required that children under 3 years of age with congenital defects be registered with the state. Those deemed unfit were taken away from their homes for special treatment. Special treatment meant being given a lethal injection or simply starved to death. Cautious, however, of public scrutiny, the Nazi strategy was slowly to get the public accustomed to euthanization and extermination before turning their full attention to the Jews. The public justification for these deaths was not only the biological health of the state. The Nazis also offered a collectivist economic justification. If the health of the citizenry is the state's responsibility, then the state has a responsibility to allocate its resources wisely. If the state allocates funds for the care of the weak, then effectively the strong are sacrificed. But it is the strong who are the state's best assets. It is they who are the realization and future of the Volk. The state accordingly has a moral responsibility not to allocate resources to the weak. If the weak perish as nature intends, then the strong are enhanced and the health of the state is improved. And this brings us to Nazi economic policy. Through education and censorship, the Nazis attempted to socialize the German mind. Through public health measures and eugenics, the Nazis attempted to socialize the German body. A natural extension of both policies is to socialize German economic production. As would be expected by the socialist part of National Socialism, the guiding policy of Nazi economics was that all property belonged to the Volk, the people, and was to be used only for the good of the people. Just as one's body was no longer one's private possession, but rather only to be used for the good of the people, so too one's economic property was no longer one's private possession, but was to be used only with state permission and only for the good of the people. Upon coming to power, the Nazis nationalized all property owned by Jews, and in 1934 they passed a law allowing the expropriation of all property owned by communists. Another early policy given high priority by the Nazi government was the reorganizing of all German businesses into cartels. The argument here was that in contrast to the disorderliness and the selfishness of free market capitalism, organizing all businesses into cartels would increase efficiency and a sense of German unity. In July of 1933, membership in a cartel became compulsory for German businesses, and in 1934 the cartel structure was reorganized and placed firmly under the direction of the German government. By 1937, small businesses with a capitalization under $40,000 were dissolved by the state. Labor unions had also been dissolved, as had been the rights to strike and collective bargaining. Unemployment was dealt with by public works programs of road building and so on. All property and labor power was now either owned outright by the state or, if still in private hands, subject to almost total state control. Businesses were told by the state what to produce and in what quantities. Wages and prices were also set by the state. And if anyone complained, a commonly used Nazi slogan put them on the defensive: the public interest before self-interest. The argument was quite clear. You are no longer a private individual seeking profit or higher wages in a capitalist economy. You and your property belong to the German people in trust, and you have a duty to serve the public interest even if it involves a personal sacrifice. There's an important subpoint worth dwelling upon for a moment here, for there's a lively debate about just how committed to economic socialism the Nazis were. After all, they did not outright nationalize all German businesses as pure socialism would require. Rather, they did leave some important businesses in private hands. A 1935 official statement put the National Socialist policy this way: the power economy will not be run by the state, but by private entrepreneurs acting under their own free and unrestricted responsibility. The state limits itself to the function of control, which is, of course, all-inclusive. It further reserves the right of intervention in order to enforce the supremacy of considerations of public interest. Here, the issue about how socialist the Nazis were involves a judgment call about long-term principles and short-term pragmatism. Here's a related example. Obviously, the Nazis were committed to racism. They were racist through and through. But we could point out that they formed alliances with the Italians and the Japanese, neither of whom were Aryans racially. It would be a mistake to infer from those alliances that the Nazis weren't really racist. They were racist, but as a matter of short-term strategic principle and compromise, they were willing to form alliances with those whom they would otherwise despise. The Italians and the Japanese were powers, and so in the short run, it makes strategic sense to overlook the racial issue to form an alliance. The same holds for economic socialism. Allowing some major businesses to remain in private hands made sense pragmatically in the short run. The Nazis knew that they needed productive enterprises to fuel the economy and the war machine, so it would have been foolish to interfere too much with smoothly running enterprises. Additionally, the Nazi government knew that they could count on the German nationalism of many business owners to give the government what they wanted. And if push came to shove, the Nazi government knew that they could and did pass precise regulations to direct production as they saw fit anyways. So while the Nazi government imposed many regulations upon businesses, the Nazis also counted on and received much voluntary commitment and enthusiasm. Many business owners, managers, and workers believed in the cause and devoted their economic energies to it. They saw the personal sacrifices that were demanded of them as their duty, and they obediently and willingly bore those sacrifices for the good of the cause. As a result, from 1932 to 1936, Germany underwent an economic boom, lifting itself out of the stagnation of the 1920s and early 1930s. Unemployment fell from 6 million to 1 million. National production increased 102%, and national income doubled. By 1936, the same year the Germans hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin, Germany was again an economic powerhouse. A national vote was held in March of that year to gauge popular support for Hitler's regime. Adolf Hitler was the only name on the ballot, and voters had a choice to vote for Hitler or not. Now, as dubious as this vote is, the numbers do tell us something. 98.6% of the voting population voted, and of those who voted, 98.7% voted for Adolf Hitler. That means 44 million adult Germans expressed support for Hitler's regime, and only about 500,000 did not. The most important part of the new Germany was the military. On a historically unprecedented scale, the German economy became a war economy. In 1935, conscription had been reintroduced, and in 1936, Hermann Göring took over as Germany's economic minister. Under Göring's direction, Germany began to develop a total war economy in earnest. Up until this time, the remilitarization of Germany had been kept semi-secret and had been paid for out of funds confiscated from enemies of the state and from blocked foreign bank accounts. But under Göring's new leadership, the remilitarization of Germany came out into the open. Also, as promised as long ago as 1920 in the Nazi Party's founding political program, the Nazis initiated a strategy of geographical expansion. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. Also in 1936, Hitler concluded an alliance with Mussolini and Italy, and he sent troops to Spain to support General Francisco Franco's authoritarian regime. There was no military response from France, England, or the other Allied powers. In 1938, Germany took over Austria. No shooting or violence was necessary. After the takeover, a plebiscite was held in which one could vote yes or no for Hitler. In Austria, 99.75% voted for Hitler. In Germany, 99.08% voted for Hitler. Hitler was actually somewhat angry that he received less support from the Germans than he did from the Austrians. Again, there was no military response from the Allies. They believed that Hitler was satisfied with his expansion to date, and they also believed him when he signed the so-called Munich Agreement, agreeing to no more expansion beyond the Sudetenland, then an important part of Czechoslovakia. As a result of Hitler's signing that agreement in 1938, Time magazine even named him its Man of the Year for 1938. Early in 1939, Germany took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Again, there was no response from the Western Allies. But on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and this time the Western Allies responded. World War II had officially begun, and the 20th century began its second great collision of incompatible philosophies of life, with the broadly liberal, individualistic, democratic, and capitalist nations of the Allied West against the authoritarian, collectivistic, and socialist Axis powers of the East. And at the end of the war, tens of millions more people would be dead. The Germans were steeled for war and well prepared physically and psychologically. They believed in Lebensraum, the rightness of Germany's expanding as much as necessary to acquire land and resources for survival. They believed in the rightness of reincorporating ethnic Germans now living in foreign lands. They believed that Germany had a moral mission, even a divine mission, to show the world to a brighter, more idealistic future and to destroy the tottering and depraved capitalist nations of the West. As Hitler put it at the beginning of the war, "What will be destroyed in this war is a capitalist clique that was and remains willing to annihilate millions of men for the sake of their despicable personal interests." And of course, the Germans had plans for the Jews. In 1821, the German poet Heinrich Heine said, "Where books are burned, in the end, people are also burned." Heine was evoking the terrible Reformation and Counter-Reformation era during which books and people were both regularly burned. But he was also making a philosophical point about the importance of ideas. Books are about ideas, and ideas matter. Human beings live what they believe, and if history teaches us anything, it's that human beings can believe an incredible variety of things about themselves and the world they live in. Books store and transmit ideas, but it's in the minds of actual human beings that ideas live and are put into practice. Burning a book has some stopping power for an idea, but the only way to eliminate fully an idea is to eliminate the individuals who believe it. Dictators know this, and they have no compunction about eliminating individuals. In this particular respect, then, the Nazis were not historically unique. They were unique in the unbelievable scale on which they operated and with the sheerly cold-blooded ruthlessness with which they destroyed, killed, and burned human beings. 11 to 12 million people were exterminated during the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million of them were Jews. We've all heard the numbers and the stories before, and it's hard sometimes for them not to become just abstract statistics in our minds. But just think of one person whom you know who lives a real life, loves his or her family, works hard, has dreams, a quirky sense of humor, wants to travel the world. And then imagine that person taken away in the middle of the night, herded into a cattle car, stripped naked, experimented upon without anesthesia, slowly starved, gassed, then shoved into an oven and burnt to cinders. That is what the Nazis did to millions of actual human beings. All of the theoretical ingredients of the National Socialist program that contributed to the Holocaust were announced publicly 20 years before the Holocaust began. That human beings are divided into collective groups that give them their identity. That those collective groups are locked in a life and death competitive struggle. That any tactic is legitimate against one's collective enemies. That human beings are not individuals with their own lives to live, but rather are servants of the state. That the state should have total power over the bodies and minds of the individuals and to direct them in the public interest. That individuals should be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the group as defined by higher authority. And throughout the 1930s, the Nazis experimented with many of the practical techniques they would use during the Holocaust. Throughout the 1930s, millions were denied basic human rights of liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness as a matter of official state policy. Many of those deemed undesirable were forced to leave their homes and country. Those who stayed were subject to officially tolerated and officially sanctioned vandalism, beatings, and occasional murders. Some of those deemed unfit to reproduce had been sterilized. Some of those deemed unfit to live had been euthanized. And as early as 1933, concentration camps were opened north of Berlin at Oranienburg and in the south of Germany at Dachau. As the 1930s progressed, more concentration camps had been added. And of course, the vicious anti-Semitism of the Nazis and their sympathizers among millions of Germans was common knowledge and common practice. It is appropriate that the classically educated Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Culture, would express it most bluntly and clearly. Certainly the Jew is also a man, but the flea is also an animal. So I return to our early question: how could Nazism happen?